Good afternoon, and welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. It's a great pleasure and honor to have with us Michelle Bachelet this afternoon. We were together last week at a conference in Montevideo on citizen security, and on that occasion, the Vice President of Uruguay, Danilo Astori, introduced Michelle Bachelet as a president of Chile with a mandato cumplido, or a completed term in office. And I like that, the way he put it. It's a lot more elegant than to say former president. And I think it also conveys a sense of accomplishment, which I think is very appropriate and fitting in this case. President Bachelet is Chile's first woman president and led her country successfully from 2006 to 2010. She presided over many important advances in social policy and in a variety of other areas. Before that, she served as a Minister of Health and also Minister of Defense under the government of Ricardo Lagos. And she has quite a remarkable personal story and biography. And as many of you know, she was both a victim and opponent to the Pinochet government, and she was in exile first in Australia and then in East Germany, and came back to Chile to complete her medical studies. She's a pediatrician by training. Currently, President Bachelet is the Undersecretary General at the United Nations and the Executive Director of UN Women. She served as the chairperson of the Social Protection Floor Advisory Group that recently issued a report several weeks ago, and she's going to talk about this afternoon the main findings of that important report, which focuses on the role of social protection programs, especially in the current context of a global economic downturn and the austerity measures that we see being carried out in a variety of countries. And it's quite fitting and fortunate that President Bachelet took on this particular assignment, because as president, she was not only committed to fighting poverty and inequality in Chile, but she also had to deal with the financial crisis of 2008. And I think that was one of her main accomplishments in the way that she dealt with that major challenge. It's important, I think, to have somebody of President Bachelet's authority and stature to speak on the subject this afternoon. She is going to talk in sort of global terms, that is the report, but we'll also talk a little bit about, and we'll certainly respond to questions concerning what Latin American governments ought to be doing to prepare for the global downturn, and what steps should be taken, what would be most helpful, what are governments doing, and what should they be thinking about in the current context. But the presentation will have a sort of a global scope and perspective. Let me just say that we are honored and delighted that President Bachelet also serves as the co-chair of the Board of Directors of the Inter-American Dialogue. And so we welcome you home here at our organization, and we look forward to listening to remarks and to having a good dialogue and a good exchange with the group that's with us. Before I give the floor over to President Bachelet, I also want to say that the dialogue itself has a very active program in social policy and education. We're working on this for a number of years, almost 20 years. Jeff Purrier is the Vice President for Social Policy, is with us this afternoon. And I also want to recognize Secretary General of the OAS, Jose Miguel Insulza, who I believe you know, who is also joining us this afternoon. So with that, I know you have a very busy schedule, President Bachelet, so we're absolutely very grateful for you taking some time to be with us this afternoon and share your thoughts about this very, very important subject. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Michael, and hello to everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you some of the key messages of the report Social Protection Floor for a Fair and Inclusive Globalization. This is the pocket version, I would say. There is a big one, too, that was launched on the 27th of October. A little bit of the background. This report was produced by an advisory group, which I had the honor to chair, in the framework of the UN Chief Executive Board Social Protection Floor Initiative. The Social Protection Floor Initiative builds on a global coalition led by the ILO, International Labor Organization, and the World Health Organization, a lot of other UN agencies, the IMF, they have been working with us. They work with us on this, Multilateral Development Bank, as well as development partners and NGOs. And the aim of the initiative is supporting countries to develop national social protection floors as part of their social protection systems. And the report, of course, is rooted in the goals and principles of the United Nations. As you know, in July 2011, the Economic and Social Council, the UN Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, adopted a resolution that, and I will quote, recognizes the need to promote and realize at least basic social protection in order to achieve decent work and nationally design social protection floors in line with national priorities and circumstances. And end of the quote. Well, I don't have probably to remind you that in 1948, the International Declaration of Human Rights called for social protection for all in the form of adequate life standards, access to health, education, food, housing, and social security. If we look at the world today, and we compare to the world in 1948, in 2010, the global GDP was 10 times larger than in 1950 in real terms, an increase of 260% per capita. Yet, despite the 6 decades of strong economic growth that followed the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, access to adequate social protection benefits and services remains a privilege afforded to relatively few people. And let me share with you some of the figures. About 5.1 billion people, 75% of the world population, are not covered by adequate social security. 1.4 billion people live on less than $1.25 a day. 38% of the global population, that means 2.5 billion people, do not have access to adequate sanitation. Almost a billion, almost 900 million people lack access to adequate sources of drinking water. And there is something then deeply and structurally wrong in the way economies and societies are evolving. We don't need to be in Wall Street or here in McPherson Square to see that, because it's clearly that this figure shows that something's wrong. The persistence of such large numbers of excluded persons represents tremendous squandered human and economic potential. And this is particularly important in the context of accelerated demographic aging in countries with low coverage of pension and health system. So where does social protection fit into this picture? The report shows that social protection can play a pivotal role in relieving people of poverty and deprivation, delivering on the promises of the Human Rights Declaration, and on the commitments on the Millennium Development Goals. The extension of social protection, drawing on basic social floors, is a missing piece in a fair and inclusive globalization. It can help people adapt their skills to overcome the constraints that block their full participation in a changing economic and social environment, contributing to improve human capital development in both the short and the longer term, and in turn, stimulating greater productive activity. So the report shows how social protection has helped to stabilize aggregate demand in times of crisis and to increase resilience against economic shocks, contributing to accelerate recovery and more inclusive and sustainable development path. And we believe that part because of, not the only reason, but one of the reasons because Latin America could respond better to the crisis and recover earlier to the first phase of the crisis was, first of all, because it had done a lot of modification of the regulation system and taken a lot of policies in terms of financial system, but also because it had social protection, some kind of social protection schemes that permitted that after the financial and economic crisis, it could be avoided a social collapse, and then, of course, a political instability. We argue that social protection represents, in fact, a win-win investment that pays off both in the short term, given its effect as macroeconomic stabilizer, but also in the long term, due to the impact of human development and productivity. The remarkable recent development on the social protection landscape in many countries has demonstrated that the extension of social protection, drawing on social floors, are necessary, are effective, but are also feasible, even in low-income countries. I'm not saying that it's easy. Don't misunderstand me. But because you need to have the right institutions, you need to have the human resources, and of course, funding mechanisms. You need to have it in place. And international cooperation, including North-South, South-South, or triangular cooperation, shall play a fundamental role in the process. But there's one point that cannot be solved by any international development mechanism, and that is political will. International cooperation can be of help for all the rest, from the design to the transfer of technology, and even for providing initial funding to start up social protection floors. But if there's no political will in the country, the chances of success will be significantly lower. And I can tell you this out of my own experience as Chilean first, and of course as head of state afterwards. Because social protection did not start in my government, it started before. But during my government, I put it as essential seal of my government from 2006 to 2010. Many reforms were implemented and huge investments were made to enhance access to health, pensions, education, housing, water and sanitation, especially to promote child development and to improve gender equality. And during this period, I would want to share with you some lessons learned about social protection. First, as important as expanding social protection, it is to coordinate actions and intersectoral policies. One of the things that you find when you are in government that every ministry is very keen of doing its mandate, of course. But sometimes you see that they build fantastic social buildings, but by themselves. So they don't have any polyclinic there, no school for the child who will go. So how you really, if you want to have a good and important relevant impact, you need to make coherence between different sectors and different policies. Policy coherence and coordination to address the multi-dimensional phases of poverty and vulnerability is at the core of the program Chile Solidario, which started with President Lagos, with my predecessor. But also in the idea that we cannot solve employment problems without addressing education issues. And I was mentioning in a little talk we had with the staff before this meeting that, for example, you can be an attractive country for investment. But if those kind of companies need English skills and you don't have the people who are educated with English skills, you might have two problems. Or investment don't come, or they will come, but they will bring workers from other countries, from their own places. So you need to deal with development, with economic growth and so on, looking at all the different aspects, employment, education. But also education performance depends on adequate health and nutritional status, which is connected to availability of water and sanitation and proper housing infrastructure. I won't receive the Nobel Prize, Intellectual Nobel Prize, after saying this. This is not the secret weapon, but the problem is that it is the secret weapon, because even we all know this, policies many times don't act like that. They are all pushing in different directions and not producing sort of the synergies that they need to produce and really create a better environment for everyone. Well, if I said if I mentioned that the first was coordination, if I would say, and coherence, the second thing that I want to share with you is the basic is better than nothing. And scarce public resources should go first to those who need them most. There's so many books about what is universality versus focusing. Well, you need to do both. I mean, you need to think on things that can be universal, but you always need to start with the ones who are in the worst condition. But you need to make it in a scheme where you understand, and that's why we speak about social protection floor, because we understand it has to be a gradual and incremental process. In extending social protection, gradualism and financial sustainability is of utmost importance. Some developing countries cannot afford to provide full protection for all contingencies to everyone. That's true, but let's start from the basics that can make an enormous difference in the life of those who have nothing. Third, social protection is about preventing, supporting, and promoting. Therefore, it's not only about protection, because mainly what we are doing is empowering people. Because when you're ensuring health, education, housing, water, sanitation, and so on, we are helping them to be somebody who is in better condition to get a better job. We empower them. Because we're not talking about assistantialism. We're not talking about creating dependency. On the contrary, it's creating to give the potential or the capacities to be developed. It's on the contrary, it's to unlock the productive capacity of women and men to participate in the economic, social, and political lives as workers, employers, consumers, and citizens. The concept of social protection floor embraces all these elements: policy coherence, gradualism, starting from the basics, sustainability, but also empowerment. And the notion of a social floor is very clear, and it will change. A social floor in a developing country with very least developed country or low-income country might be different, because every country is different, one from each other. Even they can be all in the classification of low income or middle income. So it depends on what the capacity of the countries are and the level of the country. But that's why we say floor, because we don't want this to be seen as a ceiling. It has to be increasing every time. Let me give you an example with my present capacity. I went to the Nordic countries, and somebody could say, okay, but what if you and women have to do with Nordic countries? Oh, yes, we have. We need there are salary gaps for women there. I mean, here also, and of course, there is violence against women there and here also. So even though in some places much more developed than the others, there's still a lot of things and gaps that need to be solved. So when I'm going to talk here, it might seem very basic, but that is just to say which will be the minimal for those countries that don't even have this. Other countries will start in a higher level. First, everyone should be able to have access to at least basic health services, primary education, housing, water, and sanitation, and other essential services. There are countries that already have primary education, but don't have secondary education. Some have secondary, but not a universal access to tertiary education. So it will depend. And second, that no one should be below a certain income level. It means that everyone should have access to basic income security guarantees that can be provided in different ways, in cash, various social transfers, in cash or in kind, such as pension for the elderly and persons with serious disability, child benefits, and or employment guarantees. So what does it take to move ahead? What does the report show? Firstly, and here I would like to insist on this, it is a matter of political will. Because countries have limited resources, but it depends on what is a priority for you, how you allocate resources. So political will is essential. And what does it mean, political will too? It means to give the vision, to set the principles, to define the ground rules for the societies that we want, to be prepared to overcome fiscal constraints, to make the hard decisions, and to push forward. Secondly, affordability and financial sustainability are fundamental. I said political will is essential, so if you think that something is a priority, you can make some fiscal space for that. But of course, sometimes you need additional fiscal space and can be enhanced by appropriate measures to reallocate expenditures and increase collection efficiency. While international solidarity can help to kickstart and consolidate the process of creating a floor in low-income countries, over the long run, its implementation has to be financially sustainable at national level. And let me share with you some of the studies that we did by the ILO in consultation with the IMF. What did they show? That in countries, and in the report there's much more details, I just want to share some of them with you. In countries such as Benin, El Salvador, Mozambique, and Vietnam, Major social protection floor programs would cost between 1 or 2% of the GDP. In the long run, social protection floors are not only affordable, but the more important thing, they can pay for themselves because the objective at the end is to enhance productiveness. I mean, not at the end. It's also one of the objectives. But it will produce will enhance the productiveness of the labor force, boosting, on the other hand, the aggregate demand, and therefore generating further tax revenue. So it is an ethical issue, a human rights issue, a social justice issue, but even it's an economic factor. Thirdly, the process of design and implementation of the social floor demands something that's in our experience in Chile. It demands a major social dialogue effort involving government, social partners, and the civil society, which is essential to shape common objectives and strategies that respond to national specificity and to make the necessary compromises. Michael was mentioned that we were together, we had some activities in Montevideo. In Montevideo, I was there for a delivery as one strategy assessment of the UN, but I also had my own agenda there as UN Women, and they are working now on the, how could I say, well, social protection, so they call it the care system. And to be able to design it, they did a lot of consultation with civil society, so they could include what people believe is the most important in its own definition, so it gives them also the reliability and the legitimacy of a good policy. And also the compromises, because you need to define, this will be the priority, this other thing we're not going to be able to do it, but you have a solid ground on it. Fourthly, while adopted as a universal concept, the social protection floor should be nationally shaped. I mean, national ownership is essential, not only because of what I say, adherence and really compromise, but also because it's so different one country to another, of course. Within a framework of national specific institutional structure, you have to consider economic constraints, political dynamics in every country, and social aspiration. So if here, as in many other things, one size does not fit all. Finally, as economies grow and financial and fiscal space gets wider, further increase of the level of protection should be envisaged. The floor, as I mentioned before, cannot become a ceiling, but it should be understood as the first step towards higher levels of protection, as well as creating conditions for successful insertion of the poor and disadvantaged in the labor market. So it's very important to work with the markets, with the labor policies. The social protection floor has gained overwhelming support in the global agenda, from the MDG, the Millennium Development Goals Summit, to the G20, and I'm proud, should I say, that because we did a lot of work with the Minister of Labor and Finance Minister, but I never expected that in the final declaration on Cannes, it's a chapter on fostering employment and social protection, and they note the report even. So it's, I hope they note it, they read it, and they implement it. That was much more important. But also from the ECOSOC and ILO conference, from the IMF to the NGOs, from the summit to the streets and even to the web, I would also like to invite you to sign the electronic petition in support of the social protection floor organized by the NGO Committee for Social Development at the UN, because they're aiming to collect 1 million signatures. So please go on the webpage and look at it. Well, I really think that even though this is worldwide, and I think it's so important also to Latin America, for many reasons. First of all, because Latin America has a lot of challenges. Latin America has had good performance the last 7 or 8 years in terms, of course, of commodity prices, growth linked to levels of trade, the commodity prices, solid and sound macroeconomic policies. There has been a strong combat against fiscal vulnerabilities. I would say more robust monetary frameworks. There has been a lot of different conditions that permitted them to develop counter-cyclical policies that let them respond in a better way to the economic crisis and at least to control the negative aspects of the crisis through job creation and enhancement of productivity. There's a lot of work being done in Latin America in trying to develop its own economic and financial stability model. In UNASUR, they have been working on this and looking at how they can integrate better, because UNASUR is interesting. It has been following the European Union model, but the difference, I mean, there are many differences, and you have to analyze now the European model to see if it works or not. But there is this discussion done, and it cannot be only a trade and economic alliance. It has to be mainly a political alliance, because I think one of the problems of the crisis is more political than economic and financial in its roots. But there has been. But one of the things, for example, if you go to thinking on trade, a difference from the European Union, that sort of like 80% of the trade, it's intra-regional. And in the case of Latin America, it's very low. We are all looking for markets outside Latin America, but not looking at Latin America as an interesting market. So there's lots of things that can be done. But one of the good things, because Latin America has performed so stable and successfully, is also the existence of social protection floors or social protection schemes. That I said, it has permitted Latin America to respond quicker and better to the people. One thing that I would like to say is that, and I sometimes I truly don't know why it's not clear enough. I think if we think of concrete things, I would say Latin America has shown progress, and that Latin America can build on these positive changes of the last years. It has to do a lot of things. We can discuss later on that. But if we think of Latin America itself, Latin America have a third of the, how do you say cultivable? No. Arable surface. It has a lot of, I mean, it has the biggest reserves of water, drinking water. Are you called? Fresh water. The 31% of, 20% of bushes biodiversity of the world, and so on. It has 48% of copper of the world. I have to mention copper, of course, because it's still it. 23% of zinc. I mean, when you look at Latin America, it has so many things. So it's difficult to think on the response of global crisis. I mean, it has a lot of energy. I mean, so many things that without thinking Latin America, but still, I don't see that the world, and not the world, people who are making decisions clearly look at Latin America with all its opportunities. And I think Latin America has a lot of challenges, but it has also a lot of opportunities. I would like to finish my words mentioning two things. And I hope that Latin America has had very good experiences, and I don't want to mention, because you usually forget some countries, and there will be somebody from that country who will feel offended. But there are so many good experiences on social protection, different levels, some very wide, some smaller. But but it can be also a source of cooperation with other countries, because the interesting experience on social protection and the book, we launched another book at the beginning of the year of 18 successful stories that shows that it's possible, it's feasible, and it's affordable. And we're not talking about rich countries. And I would like to see, I hope that it can help work with other countries. So I hope it will stimulate and inspire the design and implementation of social protection policies drawing on social floors as part of coherent and balanced approaches to improving the lives of people. And I say this because one of the things that we were discussing, and I was mentioning to Michael and to Jose Miguel, that when I had to share the panel of middle-income countries, and what is, because of the leveling of one, but in Busan there will be this discussion on aid effectiveness, and there is the discussion on how will the international community relate to middle income. Because again, it happens for Latin America, but it happens everywhere, that the people who behave are punished because they're successful afterwards, in terms of, I use the word punish, quoted punish, because they are doing so good so you don't receive any more funding because other people need it more than you. So it's an incredible disincentive to do good, because if you do bad, you continue receiving it. When I was Minister of Health, that happens. Hospitals were doing great. We take out the money because we gave it to the ones who were worse management. And so it's absurd, but that's how the world is going. But the problem is that if we're dealing with development, we're thinking how we improve people's capacities, people's lives. And 2 decades ago, 90% of the poor of the world live in the low-income countries. Today, 72% of the people, the poor of the world, live in middle-income economies. So even if you look with the development eyes and the poor people, the majority is not in the poor countries for many reasons. Size of population of the country who have reached to middle income and so on. But because even in those countries, there are pockets of poverty, and this poverty has to be addressed. The problem is some pockets are very big pockets. Because let's think on China or Nigeria. Nigeria, the population, it's something like 190 or something. If you have 70% of poverty, you're talking about incredible amounts of people. Let's think on Latin America. The only least developed country is Haiti. Haiti has a population of 10 million people. If you have 80% of poverty, we're talking about 8 million. So that's why average don't solve this problem. And I think it makes us think in a more sophisticated way how we're really going to need to measure the world today, because this is a much more complicated world. If we use income per capita, we're just hiding so much behind that number. There's so much middle-income countries that they have pockets of poverty, but very big pockets. So that is a big challenge for us, and now I speak about as a UN bureaucrat, to think, I hate the word bureaucrat, but it's people who work in public policies. That's the real word. We need to think, I think it needs to stimulate a bigger thinking in which are the instruments and tools we're using to understand today's world and to decide to make better decisions. So policies need to be taken to respond to the needs of people, to ensure stability and protect gains. And while it's true that Latin American countries have done a good job of weathering the storm of the financial crisis, as we all know, the crisis is not over. It is ongoing. It is structural, and therefore social protection is needed. And I will mention one country, but because I had the possibility to talk to her in the GA, in the General Assembly, when we had a meeting with President Rousseff. I mean, you know, everybody speaks about Bolsa Familia in Brazil. That has been for some years there and has had a lot of very good experience, and well, many other countries. But why I mention her is because she had decided to introduce a social protection floor, but with the objective of eliminating forever extreme poverty. And I think this will be a very, very interesting thing, that if Brazil, with its size and relevance, is able to completely avoid, is that the word? No, eradicate extreme poverty, I think it will be a very important example for many other countries. And I hope other countries will follow her lead. I will stay here, so maybe you can ask a lot of the questions. I behave because I was invited for social protection. I didn't mention the word gender, but I am so open to talk about that. But I will but I don't want to take all the time, because I'm a pediatrician, and I see that women start speaking before little boys, usually girls, but we never stop. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, President Bachelet. That was terrific, and really is an excellent overview about a very, very important report. Congratulations. We're going to open it up, but before we do, if I could ask a question, and this just in general terms, how do you see the role of private sector on this issue? And has there been progress? I think we sometimes tend to generalize about private sector, but from your experience and politics in Latin America and now at your role at the United Nations, has there been any evolution towards a greater acceptance, commitment to the kind of ideas that are in this report?
Well, there has been, because we discussed this also in ILO and in the last conference, the 100-year conference of the ILO. You know, ILO is a tripartite organization. There is employers, employees, and government there. So, we haven't had specific detailed discussions because this will be country-to-country specific in terms of what will include and how it will be funded. Right. Because there will be countries who they might have the resources. In some other countries, they might need some specific initiatives that will have some impact on or that you will need to count with, with the private sector. But I will have to say, when I was president and I spoke about all of this, the fact that this will, it could be an investment, it could mean a lot of measures. Even we didn't need it at that time because we had the money because of the copper prices at that time. All the things we did, we used this. We developed two funds, one copying the Norwegian model, so for pensions and for social benefits, two different models. So we had the money because our population is getting old, and then not today, but in 20 more years, we probably will have more passive than active force in our society, because of course maternal rates are decreasing like a more developed country, so we have those challenges. So we have the money there to be able to respond to those reforms we have done. But we were always discussing with them, so I didn't need a taxation reform, for example, because I did have the money. But in some moments, in some countries, in some moment of history, you might need that, and you need to build to negotiate, not to define, but also to bring to your side the private sector. The second thing is, of course, the private sector can do much more in terms of social responsibility and so on. But I truly believe that that's my point of view. This is not the UN, I have to say. This is personal Michelle Bachelet point of view. I do believe in the state. I do believe that you can have the private sector as an ally, and it has to be, you have to build public-private partnership, and I have very good experience on that, building private-public partnership. But it's the state with all its powers and executive power who has to lead, who has to, of course, I would say something obvious. Presidents, in case of Chile, prime minister in other cases, are the ones who are elected. They're the ones people put the confidence in. So you need to do what you promise you're going to do. And you need to build alliances with the private sector as with the civil society in terms of pushing together on an agenda. But I would say when you talk to them, and I think it makes sense, the idea that this is important socially, politically, and every private sector wants political stability, but also economically. It's a very important economic factor to have citizens, employees that are really well qualified, and even if you look at it in the more cold, if I may say, economic perspective, that they're more productive, and that will give them more competence, competitiveness, and more rentability, and so on. So I think, I had very good, personal good experience in that sense. But of course, when you have to discuss concrete instrument and concrete initiative, well, it won't be that easy. But I think in a global concept, that is something that it's understandable.
Great, thank you. Why don't we open up? If you could just wait for the microphone, because this is being webcast, and identify yourself. Jeff, you want to start? Jeff, earlier from the dialogue. Is that working?
What do you do in a case where the political will is there, in the sense that the country is willing to dedicate the money necessary for this minimum level of social protection, but the quality of the services being provided, whether it's education or health care or housing or whatever, fall far short of the quality that the poor need to really get ahead and be protected? How do you think about that?
Well, I know it's very global, but let me give you an example. You need to work with those countries to try to improve that capacities, and it can be done. I was part of a network called Leaders for MDGs 4 and 5, that is maternal mortality and infant mortality. So what we did is we launched this network in South America. And 4 countries wanted to work with Chile. That was the 4 countries that have the, I would say, the lower indicators on maternal mortality and infant mortality. And that was Paraguay, Ecuador, Bolivia, or 3 then, 3 countries. And what we did, we worked with their experts, with the technical experts. We helped them identify which were the main obstacles and problems they had, and we helped them with the international community to develop those capacities for what they, it's a concrete example. It could be so different, so many. In some other places, it could be through bilateral or multilateral to ensure how they can to bring through cooperation the capacity of making their mines more productive, for example. So it can be in many different ways to help them have more funding and financial sustainability, or in the technical capacities. So I think there's enough experience on more similar basis countries, because of course, I mean, when we're thinking of developed countries, conditions are so different that sometimes, even though there's a goodwill on North-South cooperation, it's not very useful because they're starting from a so different level. In some areas it's very useful, but in some others not. I think human resources is essential. That's why education is essential. But also, in terms of making sustainable this, you need to work much more on innovation and so on. Second thing, I believe that one thing is the work at the country level. But the second thing is, well, that means it's not for tomorrow, because you will have to take some time. For example, again, maternal mortality. Maternal mortality is so high in the world. Every minute a woman dies of the consequences of while giving birth of around birth. And you ask yourself, and I'm a medical doctor, so excuse me to give this example, but they're so simple examples. I mean, we're not talking about a strange epidemic who came, a new virus that nobody understands what's going on, and that nobody has sort of like the, remember the flu 2 years ago, that nobody knew how little it was, and so on. We're talking about something that is as old as humanity, and we exactly know what we should do to avoid one maternal death. I mean, you will always maybe have some, but all what you need to do is known. So, but the thing is that, for example, in some countries in the past, they didn't develop a lot of things that can be very useful. And they're saying, okay, we don't have enough doctors. You don't need enough doctors. If you train midwives, it's much shorter, cheaper, and much useful. And if you, you train 5,000 midwives, and there's so many people who can go and train midwives, and you will decrease, and that's the experience I could mention, and that's what we're working with Paraguay, Ecuador, and Bolivia, I mean, on whatever they have defined. Because many times people who don't have the experience, they believe they need to build big hospitals. You don't need to have big hospitals. You can have health facilities with trained personnel, and you will decrease mortality rate. That's the experience of Tanzania. President Kikwete did that in like 3-4 years and decreased maternal mortality incredibly. So I'm not to talk only about Latin America. So what I mean to say is that the more important thing is to identify which are the main obstacles, the bottlenecks that you need to solve, and finding those. There will be other people with experience, and there will be, and probably there will be even money if you don't have it, because when you know exactly what you need to do in a so fundamental issue, you can find the response. But it won't be a 1-minute solution. You need a little bit of time.
Great, thank you. Yes. Right.
Hi, thank you. President, thank you so much. This was great. My name is Carolina Costa, and I work with McClarty Associates in Washington, a consulting company, and we advise a number of clients and multinationals with investments in Latin America region and beyond. One of our clients is Walmart, and Walmart, talking about the private sector role, they have just started a very large initiative to promote and enhance the role of women in the countries where they are. It's called Women 360, and it's just a very good example of how the private sector is engaging with stakeholders to enhance the role of women. You touched upon public-private partnerships with the government. I would be curious to just hear a little bit of your perspective on how the UN and the private sector could be partnering on issues related to women and development of women around the world. Thank you.
Well, I didn't mention one obvious thing is that when we're talking about social protection, we're talking about inclusiveness. We're talking of people who are included in the benefits of a society. And inclusiveness means women too. And we usually have an important gap, and everybody says that, well, I hope from rhetoric to action we can go a little bit faster, that women are sort of the secret weapon, for peace, for development, for MDGs, for whatever you want. Women are spectacular. It's not happening yet, but at least it is a lot of beautiful speeches on this direction. But I have to say, even from the economy, not only what women can win on a public-private partnership, even the economy, one of the things that everybody knows is that diversity will mean better decisions. If you include people from diverse conditions, it will mean better choices, because if you have only a homogeneous group, that will bring you probably not to see a lot of different areas, and your policies might not be the best one, not only in a political area, but also in the economical areas. In the economical area, it's so strange that still, even in this country, only 3% of CEOs are women, or even less, I think, but it's all around that. Because if you think, and consumers are mainly female in the world, they are making the consumption decision. So it's very strange, because sometimes I was telling many people, don't hire so much consultants. Put more women in your senior management teams and on your board, and they will help you make the right decisions because they will be representing us important parts. So gender perspective on social protection, on development, on MDGs, on everything that you can imagine, on peace and security is so important. Going to your direct question. As UN Women, the UN, since the time of Kofi Annan, they developed what is called Global Compact. This is a UN big group that works with the private sector in many different aspects. And probably at the beginning thinking more on the philanthropic way. How can the private sector help the UN and help the countries and so on? And now it's more a partnership in terms of transformational change, how the private sector can be part of these changes. In the concrete case of UN Women, we have many different things. But one of the things is for us, economic empowerment is one of our priorities, because we believe that there won't be gender equality if women are not empowered. And if women don't have an income, it will be very difficult to ensure their rights. So for us, that is one especially important issue. So we are working with the private sector, first of all, to think on women, but on all the different levels of the supply chain, as consumer and a worker, entrepreneur, CEO, senior team, and all trader. All different areas women in all the value chain can be of importance, and to have specific policies on that. Second, we work on what's called the women's empowerment principles at the labor and at the labor place. And it's 7 principles that speaks about, and that's signed by companies. And it's a commitment of companies how they improve women's situations inside their companies in terms of preventing sexual harassment, labor harassment, in terms of ensuring women can be receive qualifications and training, in terms of women being able to, if they are qualified and have merit, to be part of the management teams. We are also, how could I say, encouraging, incentivizing member states to think on policies as the one that Norway has developed in terms of having more women on the boards, because the experience of Norway is very positive. There has been laws passed in France, in Spain. I think Italy was going to pass. In the European Union, it's voluntary. They are pushing, encouraging, but it's voluntary still. So there's many things, and specifically we have been working with some companies. I won't name anyone specifically, but we have been dealing with them in terms of trying to build on the win-win solutions, how we can work for women at the different countries where these companies are, and how they can think on policies in terms of not only look at them as consumers, but also how you can strengthen their capacities as a producer or even as a consumer and so on. So we are working a lot on the private sector, but not only on the traditional thinking on fundraising. That wouldn't bad at all, I have to say, because we need a lot of money, but and we don't have it. But still thinking how we build win-win things, possibilities.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you. My name is David Jocelyn. I'm an advisor to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. So much of what happens to women gets defined when they're girls. This is especially true in agrarian societies where under any kind of stress, girls eat less, work more, and go less frequently to school. Seems to me that this doesn't require improvements at the margin. It seems to me that it requires revolutionary change especially in agrarian societies. Do you think that's happening? Are there signs that it might happen?
Well, what I've seen, but you mean on access, on cultural differences, changes? Because on access, we see that in least developed countries and low-income countries, I believe that girl education is essential. It's essential. Of course, education is under UNESCO's mandate, but it's on all of us because we won't have health. You see, there are studies of the World Bank on what defines the prognosis of a child in Guatemala. What is the possibility, just to mention Guatemala, could be El Salvador anyway, the possibility of that girl, that boy to be a doctor, a lawyer, or whatever a possibility is, it's completely linked to the education of the mother. Completely linked. If you look at the child, of course, the nutritional status of the pregnant woman, but education, if you isolate all the rest of the factors, the one factor that is key is education. So I completely agree with you that that's an essential point. Even to my surprise, when I went like 3 weeks ago in Denmark to this Green Growth Forum, this guy from McKinsey, he mentioned that I haven't read the paper because I couldn't go to that meeting. I have a meeting with the new female prime minister in Denmark. He mentioned that if he could, of all the interventions done for climate change, there are many of them that they were very doubtful that they will work. But one thing he could say it would work and it would be essential is girl education. So because of, how you, all the kinds of things you can then perform in your daily basis activities and how you also. So I believe there is advance and progress in terms of primary education, but still in many low-income countries, secondary education is a luxury. So I think much more has to be done, and of course tertiary education. But on the other hand, there is sort of a paradox, and that's why probably UN Women, even though it's called UN Women because women are more precarious situation, it's called for gender equality. What you see in developed countries, that boys are dropping out of school. I'm not talking, probably it's minorities in terms of social and ethnical minorities. It's not that all Nordic boys are dropping out of school. Maybe it has a lot of other components, but we see that there and in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean countries, you see drop out of school of boys. So we need to study what's going on. In the Caribbean, I can imagine in many places. There are so many other issues. People are incentivized to work soon and have money, so on and so. But But I would say that we need to do much more on girl education. Access is improving, but in many places, education has to be paid, so poor people cannot pay. And the other thing, we need to ensure in many countries girls don't go enough to school because of the threats it includes. In conflict countries, we have seen an UNESCO launch last year report that school and children were direct targets. Not, oh, sorry, we lost the missile. No, it was a direct target in conflict. And second thing is how we improve the conditions for girls to go to schools, because fathers won't send them if security from home to the school or inside the school, if they're going to be raped or going to have any kind of gender-based violence. So one of the things is you need to look at the issue in a more comprehensive way. That's why we have a girl education task force with many different agencies to see how we ensure, because this is, I believe, is essential. And the last thing is not only about access. That's the first point, but the second is how women can really, utilize or use that education. If you go to the Arab world, you will see that the tertiary education is higher now in women than men, but then women, they don't have jobs. So you need to look at you have to think on social protection, but you need to link it to labor policies. Otherwise, you could have a lot of qualified people. And one of the problems we have seen in many of the situations happening in the world today is in many places it has not been at the beginning the poor people who started demonstrating. You can see a lot of middle class, very high qualified people who are demonstrated. So that's our call, to make it a more comprehensive way so you can really have a fairer world to live in, a more equitable world to live in.
Great, thank you. Yes, Myra.
Hi, thank you. This is Mayra Bubinic, formerly from the World Bank. If I can ask a question about gender, but doesn't have anything to do with social protection.
It's okay.
I've always, it's remarkable, I think, the success of women leaders in Latin America. In a very conservative, socially conservative region, we have more women presidents than in every other region in the world. How can you explain that?
We rock. Well, I think it's very interesting what you mentioned, because 3 presidents and 2 prime ministers right now, Trinidad, Tobago, and I'm not sure, San Martin, the island that was Dutch and just had independence at the beginning of the year. So it's incredible, but I don't know if I'm in the capacity right now to make a sort of a comprehensive explanation, because probably the thing is that this has been very powerful women always. Laura Chinchilla, I met her when she was vice president, and I was impressed because of her clarity, the intelligence, and the strength. And she was vice president, so she was not talking about somebody who was unknown and suddenly appear as a star, new star in the ceiling. Cristina Fernandez, she was a senator. She was very active. So she was, and some minute the wife of the president, of course, but she has been in politics for so long, and so she had her own development and merit and so on. But on the other hand, Dilma, well, she, I would say, she was working with Lula all the time. She was doing a lot of the most important areas. She was there in the center. So I don't know the prime minister situations, but I would say we're talking about women who has been working very strongly by their own merits in governments with very successful presidents. So I would say, but I might be completely wrong, and maybe in 20 years I would say I was wrong. But I think what happens is some of the things that I always ask myself, how we get more visibility of these extraordinary women. And I think they were good, and they had visibility for different reasons. Because what happens in many places is that you don't see the women leaders. You don't see them. And people don't see them then, so they don't consider them as possible candidates. But because of many different reasons, these are talking about very strong women, capable women, but also have the opportunity of being visible. Because in my own experience, I always said, some people don't like when I said this, but because I try to explain two things. First, you need to be visible. Nobody knew me before I was Minister of Health. But second, you need to be visible not only as a caregiver. Nobody would ever thought of me being President, being Minister of Health. When I became Minister of Defense, things changed. So I believe you need to be visible, and you need to be visible in powerful and strong positions. I mean, and I think that has happened because of many different reasons. They're all capable people, very good ones, but there are so many other women in the world, fantastic, but sort of haven't had probably the opportunity, haven't given, I would say given, the opportunity to be visible. Because it's very difficult. You know, I think one of the things for women is that political parties not always, I'm trying to be diplomatic here because it's being recorded, not always open the spaces for very good women. But the second thing probably is that there is an issue, and in Latin America in particular, and that is, again, social protection is very important, even though we wouldn't thought it's related. If we don't solve the problem of the economy of care in Latin America, we will never be able to, I would say, unleash all the potential. Because if women have to be the ones in charge of children, disabled people, sick people, even though they can be fantastic, they're not able, to develop all their capacities. And I had a concrete experience. We had a very low, and still lower than other countries in Latin America, of female labor participation. And when we started with all the nursery program and kindergarten program, in 4 years we really could increase, I would say dramatically in terms of very fast, not dramatically as I would, the female labor participation. So when you look at women, in politics it's not different at all, because women need to make decisions on private and public life. And so many women don't go into politics because that means that the family, the husband, and so on. And so one of the things is that even though in Latin America we do have this, I don't have the whole answer, and I think we need more time to really have a very good answer. I was just trying to think while you ask, so please don't write that my thesis is that that's the reason. But I think at least it helped. It helped the possibility of good women being visible.
Thank you. You have a question? There was a question back there? Yes. Okay.
Hi, Michelle. My name is Anita Bini. I am from Brazil. And I have a question. We are talking about the issue of gender. How can we change the cultural issue of women historically being seen or being considered as inferior than men, and the power and control issue that exists in many societies that somehow does not create the possibility for women to evolve, like issues of sexual harassment or issues of labor harassment. Those are things that are, in fact, a consequence of a culture of machismo, or in many cultures, in many countries. How do you see that the society could change that culture so that we could, not as a feminist movement, but much more of a human rights movement, to really create a culture of equality among all human beings?
Well, it's so linked what I just spoke. I mean, if you give the possibility of women that people can see women's capacities and capabilities. You know, it's so important, symbolic things too. If I would have tried to think on policies to make a cultural change, maybe I wouldn't have had success. By being a women president, it made it so important change in culture. When I was a candidate, guys will go and say, I will never vote for a woman. Women are incapable. But it was funny because they didn't say it in my face. It was like I was walking like there. I said, I will never vote for a woman. Women are incapable. And so I came back and said, tell him in my face. I can speak to you about that. So, and you have your right, because then he said, my wife will vote for you, but I will. What happened 4 years later? There might be still people who believe that, but probably nobody will speak it out loud, you know, because there is a sort of a cultural change to say, well, no, women are capable, not only the president, ministers, women in many different, so you need to give women you need to appoint women. And so I think this is, again, political will. When I was so criticized when I did my paritarian government, not only cabinet, but all over the government, because I'm so convinced that when people don't know the capacities, they don't believe it. They don't rely on it. But when they see the capacities, they change their point of view. And I saw it and the other thing is how you make this, how women can be role models for young people. And I always mention, excuse me to sound anecdotic, but it's not anecdote. It's how people feel and live what is important at the end when we're talking about culture. When I was made to defense health, a lot of little girls came to me and said, in Latin America, you know, at least in Chile, I don't know, in Brazil, they say auntie or aunt or uncle to the grown-ups. And say, auntie, I want to be like you when I'm grown up. I want to be a doctor. And then they say, I want to be like you. I want to be a president of the republic. So after being president, for girls and some age, it was normal to think that a woman could be a president, or that a woman can be a minister, or that a woman can be a member of parliament. So I truly believe that we need to do policies, but we need to ensure that you have more women involved in decision-making positions, because otherwise it will be only speech, beautiful speech, and everybody will agree on that. So that's why we are focusing on political empowerment and economic empowerment. Of course, other issues, violence and peace and security, but even violence and peace and security, if women are not empowered or are if they're empowered, they can respond better to that. And I have a very beautiful narrative, but I hope you haven't heard me before, because I usually mention it because I think it's so clear about this. If you have heard me, you'll forgive me. Is this like the case of the Finland president, Tarja Halonen? In January, she will end her time. She has been 12 years as president of Finland. So she went like 3 years ago to this kindergarten. She was speaking to the little children and was asking what they want to be when they're growing up. And some answers, the typical answers of the children, you know, I want to be a firefighter, I want to be a police, I want to be a doctor, a nurse, a model, I suppose, on some of that. I don't know, Nordic country, well, probably. And so and so. And then she asked the little boy, we're talking about 6-year-old, 7-year-old, and she asked him, don't you want to be the president of Finland? And the answer of this little boy was, in this country, men cannot be president of the republic. All his life, he has seen a woman. So what it looks like I'm talking about, not important things are really important, because it's culture, you build it every day. You build it with the films that you're seeing on the television. And that's something that Gina Davis, for example, is working in Hollywood, how you change the patterns and the models. And you show that women can be strong, can be on the corporate area. They can be in the defense and so on. So because that's the way you change culture. Not by saying, okay, let's be nice with women and give them a space. No, it's by showing what women really are, as good as men in many different areas.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm a consultant with the American Society of International Law. Thank you so much, Madam President, for your remarks. You mentioned several times partnerships with the ILO and with the IMF. What about your partnerships with the World Bank? And I particularly mention that because of, from what I know from colleagues there, the questioning of the Washington Consensus about traditional approaches to development, and a commitment within the bank on gender issues, including internal personnel and as evidenced by the current World Development Report, which focuses on gender and development.
Well, I mentioned ILO and IMF because we partner with this report specifically, and in this report I started this report to share this advisory group before being UN Women, so it's on that capacity. But with the World Bank, we have a very good relationship. When Madame Bouvenich was there, we started. Well, I mean, she started many years ago, but while I was being executive director, we worked fantastically with them. And now, and we have been working in many different issues, and even they have invited me as executive director of UN Women to be part of the gender advisory group of the World Bank, where we are discussing not only the findings of the report, but also trying to find answers to a lot of questions that comes from the report. So, and our intention is to continue working with a very strong partnership, because I believe this is also a very win-win partnership. And in many places we have, with one of the vice presidents, Rachel, we have been meeting in different places, and we are trying to identify some specific interventions that we can work together. Because really, women are essential to the economy and, of course, and to social and political stability. So, as I said, we will continue working in different lines. We have been working also with development banks and trying to how could I say, mainstream gender, but mainstream not in the sense as I see mainstreaming many places that everybody's in charge, nobody's in charge, and it's a cross-cutting issue, so you don't find the budget on gender anywhere. That's not the idea, but we have been working on that, and in the most different areas. For example, there was this seminar on infrastructure and gender. Probably if I ask many of you what's the relation between infrastructure and gender, will tell me nothing. Infrastructure is about, cement and ports and roads, and what is that related to? It's so related. I mean, in any different area. We were just talking about schools. If schools don't have bathrooms separate for girls and boys, some parents won't send them to school because they will think there is a threat. This is a very simple thing, but if we think on building roads, and you have in African countries where the majority of the agricultural labor force are female, you can choose the place so they can have access to market or not. So there's so much linked to even a so hard issue and not soft issue as infrastructure, or, of course, obvious issues as IT, technologies, communications, and so on, that can so much improve women's conditions. There was this fantastic example of Bangladesh. There's a company working on cell phones, and they developed a program linked to providing cell phones for these women. So it was very interesting because he mentioned that in order to do that, he had to sit down before with the husbands of the women, and the husband agreed on that because they wanted to keep track on what the women were doing. So that was, I mean, what I would say maybe for the wrong reason at the beginning, but it was a very good initiative. It permitted those women to develop their little companies, to have access to markets, and I mean everything that can give you a communication tool like that. So I would say with the World Bank, we are working on that. With other banks, we're thinking how we can, and with the World Bank, when Amara was there, it was developed some sort of credit lines. Idea 16 is that the word, isn't it? Credit lines that for gender activities specifically, and I have a signed agreement with the American Development Bank to consider gender as a very important issue in all their activities and action, not only in terms of financing gender initiative, but also on how projects that come to the bank to be financed. how they should include the gender perspective in terms of how it will impact positively or negatively women. I mean, those studies come, but usually what happens is that they're not gender disaggregated. So what we are asking as we are working with countries to gender disaggregate statistics, for example, to be able to measure progress. With the banks, we're also working on how we can ensure that countries will have access to funds in terms of gender issues, but also to include how this project will be positive or not for women.
Well, I'm mindful of the time, and I know that President Bachelet has to catch a train back to New York, and she's had a very, very busy day, a hectic day here in Washington. This has been a very, very rich and stimulating discussion, and I think you've covered a lot of ground and a lot of issues, given us a lot of things to think about as we leave, and so I just want to thank you for joining us this afternoon, and hopefully we'll have more of these kind of sessions. I think they're extremely useful. I know you have a very busy schedule, so please join me in thanking President Bachelet.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, that's
You may.